Guinea's first freely elected president has been officially sworn in. Alpha Condé took the oath of office on Tuesday.
With smiles from ear to ear, supporters of Guinea's incumbent president celebrated Saturday.
And Guinea's President Alpha Condé has won 59.49% of votes in a hotly contested election where he sought a controversial third term, according to...
On the streets of Conakry, gunfire near the presidential palace. In a nearby opposition stronghold neighborhood, joy in the streets as news spread that President Alpha Condé had been deposed in a coup.
We are very, very happy.
From Triple E Media, I'm Rahmat Muhammad, and this is The Backstory.
In December 2010, Alpha Condé was elected as Guinea's first president to be voted under a democratic constitution.
And 4 years later, in October 2015, he was re-elected for a second term. Now, by 2019, Condé's government had managed to reform Guinea's mining sector in order to boost the growth of the economy.
But I think you've been a bit humble in terms of some of the achievements that Guinea has made over the past years, which has contributed then to boosting activity in the mining sector and then also boosting GDP. And you've had like 8.5%.
Between 2016 and 2019, Guinea's GDP was growing at about 8.5%, and it was projected to continue growing at 6% in the next few years. This is much higher than the growth in sub-Saharan Africa, which is around 4%, and the rest of the world at 3%. So Guinea was doing really well as of 2019. At the same time, Condé's second term was coming to an end.
Guinea has a two-term limit for presidents, and Condé's term was supposed to end in December 2020. But instead of making plans to step down, Condé decided to push through a referendum to change the constitution in a way that would allow him to extend his stay in office. Despite the protests, the people voted on the referendum, and 92% of Ghanaian voters supported the changes to the constitution. That's according to Guinea's Independent National Electoral Commission. And in October 2020, Condé was elected to a third term under the new constitution.
Condé was sworn in 2 months later in December. Then 8 months after that, in August, he was deposed in a military coup.
The coup that happened last month in Guinea is not Africa's first coup. In fact, it was coup number 211 since the year 1950. Over 40% of the coups that have happened around the world since 1950 have happened in Africa. So Guinea's coup is not the continent's first coup, and it most certainly will not be our last. What are some of the factors that increase the risk of coups in parts of Africa? Alex and Richard are here to explain.
A coup d'etat is when the military or some other powerful group attempts to remove the sitting government, usually by force, or without going through the democratic process and its established rules.
Between 1950 and 1989, coups were actually very popular occurrences around the world. So during that time, Latin and South America and parts of Africa accounted for 2/3 of the world's coups. A large reason for that had to do with the Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union. Remember that the Cold War was all about ideological and economic dominance. And the two powers at the time, the US and the Soviet Union, sponsored coups and counter-coups in order to set up regimes that would, be favorable to them while excluding their rivals.
After the Cold War in the 1990s, coups in Latin America and South America basically disappeared overnight. The tension between the US and the Soviet Union was the main reason for coups in that part of the world. But in parts of Africa, especially in the Sahel countries in West Africa, the coups have continued long after the Cold War ended.
In the region in general, I think that broadly you're going to see very similar conditions in a lot of different countries.
That's Dr. Jonathan Powell.
I'm currently an associate professor in the School of Politics, Security, and International Affairs at the University of Central Florida. My research interests have long focused on political stability and instability, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. And over time, my research has become much more focused on the issue of militaries intervening in politics.
Now, according to Dr. Powell, countries in the Sahel share certain baseline risk factors that make coups more likely to occur in the region.
So all of them might have the same kind of general backdrop in terms of a lot of these variables that might look at countries' overall history or level of economic development, economic performance, and things like that. But usually there's going to have to be something very important in the short term that acts as some sort of catalyst.
In order to identify the short-term catalysts that ignite coups and start coups, Dr. Powell and other researchers relied on a computer algorithm called CoupCast. CoupCast uses historical data and machine learning to predict the likelihood of a coup attempt occurring in a country on a monthly basis.
The machine learning stuff that this CoupCast project does, one of the things that it's told us is that elections are going to be very, very important. And we've always known that elections were important. We've always known that elections have frequently occurred around the time that coups occur. But the data that we're getting on this stuff just really tells us how dangerous election season can be, even when elections are over and you think a country might be in the clear.
But obviously, elections alone are not the only triggers for coups. I mean, if that were the case, we'd be seeing coups everywhere across Africa. If a coup happens around election time, then other factors are most likely at play.
And if you look at West Africa, what's been going on lately, and if you look at what's going on elsewhere in the world, places like Honduras in 2009, where a coup overthrew President Zelaya, or the coup attempt against Erdogan in Turkey in 2016, these often share commonalities where you are seeing what we would refer to as executive aggrandizement, where leaders are either circumventing term limits to be able to lengthen their time in office, or they're directly doing things of the Constitution that gives them more powers than they had than when they first came into office. And in Africa in particular, this has been a very common theme for recent coups. Niger, they had the failed coup attempt earlier this year, around 10 years ago, in 2010, actually. Tanja was overthrown in a coup after doing similar things, sidestepping term limits, increasing his own power. We've seen failed coups occur in these situations. So Burundi a few years ago, with an attempted coup against President Nkurunziza, was directly in response to his efforts to try to circumvent term limits. So this issue in particular is something that has been, really at the forefront of coup events in recent history, both in Africa and internationally. So when President Condé was going through this, and especially when you see things like public resistance against this, it had very little popular support. And then you start to see things like crackdowns that would further undermine the legitimacy of the government. This is really a very strong recipe for the expectation that a coup could occur.
So, Alex, Richard, if leaders are extending their term limits just so that they can stay in power longer, and the coups are happening in response to that, basically in order to stop them from holding on to power, isn't that a good thing?
Well, not really. You see, what you are talking about here is what some people would call a democratic coup or a good coup. This is when coup leaders try to interpret the coup as a good coup because they are getting rid of someone they believe is a bad guy.
But I think we should be very careful in interpreting it that way for a few different reasons. One, since coups have been occurring, coup leaders have attempted to justify their actions with promises of opening up the political system, stamping out corruption, and things like that. And it rarely works out that way. And if you look at some of the most notorious coup leaders in history, folks like Joseph Mobutu, Idi Amin, these folks would specifically use phrases like, it's not a coup, it's a peaceful revolution. My administration will be a caretaker regime pending a quick return to civilian rule. And then these folks end up being in power, sometimes indefinitely. So a lot of times the justification that folks are giving and the justification that folks can use for staging coups might just be an excuse to serve what might be personal interest or the organizational interest of the armed forces. On the other hand, you might have soldiers that might be at least wannabe do-gooders in the sense that they think they are acting on behalf of the best interest of the country, and that the country will be better off with this, and they might be able to right the ship. That even if you do have that sort of an intention, this is a very dangerous game to play.
And it's a dangerous game because there is always a risk that the coup could fail, and even if the coup does succeed, there is the aftermath.
Because a lot of times, even if a coup does succeed and you might get rid of the government that you think is the problem, governing after that, or more generally addressing the problems that led to the coup to begin with, are much more difficult for militaries to be able to try to navigate.
But even with this risk, some militaries in the Sahel countries are still willing to carry out coups.
So to discourage coup plotters, governments try to implement different strategies and tactics.
In terms of what governments try to do, a lot of times they'll try to build up what we might refer to as an armed counterweight, where they'll come up with a presidential guard unit that in theory should act to protect them against potential coup plotters. The intelligence services will often monitor folks who might be seen as problematic and do preemptive arrests and things like that. The public can have a very important say in this. When the public comes out and protests against coups, coup leaders are far more likely to step away from power more quickly and allow a return to civilian rule. And internationally, and this is something that I think is going to be really crucial in the case of Guinea, relevant international actors like the AU and ECOWAS, they can play a very important role in determining the future of coups in the region by setting a very clear precedent that these are not going to be tolerated by regional actors.
It's true that ECOWAS and the African Union, the AU, have been pretty consistent in coming out to condemn and sanction recent coups on the African continent.
African Union Chairperson Cyril Ramaphosa has condemned the coup in Mali. Now, in a strongly worded statement, he demands that the military release the president, Prime Minister.
Will not tolerate power from the barrel of a gun. This is the message from the AU Peace and Security Council meeting on Guinea. The council has asked for the immediate release.
But even though the AU has been quick to condemn the coups, it stayed pretty quiet when it comes to current and incumbent leaders who try to extend their stay in office through constitutional amendments. As of 2020, 16 countries across Africa have passed amendments that either modify or completely eliminate the two-term limit, allowing incumbent leaders to effectively shortcut or short-circuit the democratic process. And the AU has not really been making a big deal about this.
In terms of dealing with a very large and important issue of manipulating constitutions in order to increase power and in order to stay in power longer, the continent does have a very serious challenge here. And this is one of the current hypocrisies, not just in ECOWAS, but also in the African Union more generally, where if you look at the AU Charter on governance, what they would call unconstitutional maintenance of power is supposed to be something that fits into their framework that they're supposed to be trying to prohibit in the continent. Military coups are, they're very easy to target. They're easier to identify as potential wrongdoing. They've been far more likely to attempt to sanction military coups. Executive aggrandizement, on the other hand, there has been far more tolerance of that. And it seems like the region is becoming more tolerant in recent years, and because the regional bodies have not shown a very strong interest in trying to prevent this from happening. But these things happening is specifically what has encouraged a lot of coups in the region.
And even beyond the African Union, other international actors and organizations have stayed pretty silent about attempts to manipulate constitutions in order for presidents to stay in power.
But I think the importance here is the signal that international actors send. And there had been a while where it looked like external actors were going to be strongly and harshly condemning unconstitutional changes of power. Unfortunately, in the last 5 years or so, I think that we've seen the opposite. Zimbabwe, the African Union, and SADC basically pretended nothing happened. When we look at some of these events in West Africa, we might see things like suspensions, but they're very quickly lifted. Once you have some sort of a follow-up election, foreign actors like the United States might temporarily withdraw military aid, but these don't necessarily have lasting repercussions. And as soon as you get to some sort of at least quasi-return to civilian or democratic rule, things like aid dollars can start flowing back in.
We've seen how Western countries tie their economic assistance to what's going on, domestically within the country. But China, which is becoming a large growing influence in Africa, doesn't really care how we handle domestic affairs. I mean, just as long as their economic interests are protected.
China makes it explicitly clear that all of their economic assistance is done without consideration of what's going on domestically. So if you start to see that sort of a political philosophy, and in the last few years, Russia might be becoming more relevant in this regard as well. If you have that sort of a policy from a potential external patron, that enters us more into a period of time that might be similar to the Cold War, where if you did have a military coup, not only might the international community not care, you might actually be rewarded for it in certain ways. If the new government coming into power manages to please some sort of patron, like a China. Now, to be clear, we're not to the situation yet that would be comparable to the Cold War and how these dynamics would play. But I think that with the rise of China on the continent, you do see a situation where you will see less incentive to do things like tolerate civilian rule and be willing to allow return to democracy after coups.
Now, it could also be that regional and international bodies have more tolerance for coups and executive aggrandizement because the priority in Africa right now is stability in whatever form it may come. The continent needs social and political stability to develop economically. And actually, strong economies tend to have strong democracies.
One of the biggest predictors that we would have as to whether or not a democracy is going to survive is the level of wealth in a country. And at one point in time, this was basically a law of comparative politics, where once your level of wealth hit a certain GDP per capita, there were literally no historic examples of democracies backsliding. In the last 20 years or so, we've seen a couple exceptions to that, Venezuela and Turkey, perhaps the most notable ones for it. But there's a very compelling story to be told about the association between democratic survival and state wealth. So economics is going to be very important for the region.
And it's really hard to build the economy and to build wealth when you don't have social and political stability. So one of the challenges that the Sahel region, including Nigeria, is having right now is the issue of security as a result of social and political instability.
And unfortunately, with this comes a responsibility to have to redirect funds towards the armed forces. It acts to increase reliance on things like foreign military assistance, even the presence of foreign soldiers. And while this might sometimes be seen as a good thing in terms of trying to deal with a security issue, these are things that still undermine the legitimacy of governments.
This last point that Dr. Powell makes is critical. Things that undermine the legitimacy of a government are essentially the things that increase the likelihood of coups. Take, for example, corruption undermines the legitimacy of a government, and we've seen this in the case of Nigeria. The first set of coups in our country centered around the issue of, corruption. Now, Ghana is an example of a country that has managed to avoid the cycle of coups for about 40 years now.
And Ghana had their last successful coup, I think, in 1981, where Jerry Rawlings came in again, and he ended up staying in power for around 20 years. But after he left, we haven't seen leaders in Ghana do the sorts of flagrant things that you see in a lot of other places that would undermine their own legitimacy in the electoral process and would incentivize mass protests and would incentivize their military to actually target them. So in Ghana, we have seen multiple peaceful transfers of power between victors from different electoral camps. And this is going to be very important. Had Ghana had political leadership that was trying to do things like what we saw with Condé or with Nkurunziza, the situation could have played out quite differently. It could have had drastic domestic consequences in terms of people willing to protest against the government and the military's willingness to be able to get involved in the political fray again.
So this issue of actions that undermine the legitimacy of government is very key. And as you know, in Nigeria, we haven't had a military coup since 1999, but we've had moments that have threatened to undermine the legitimacy of our governments.
For example, in 2006, former President Olusegun Obasanjo attempted a bid for the third term. His bid was quickly rejected by Senate, but it definitely left the country questioning the legitimacy of his rule. The security issues that have plagued Nigeria since 2009 have also led people to question the legitimacy of Jonathan's administration and now the Buhari government. But according to Dr. Powell, the likelihood of a coup in Nigeria at the moment is low.
Well, one of the things that I would be clear about in the Nigerian case is its circumstances are going to be much different today than they were in previous episodes when coups that had occurred. And one of the specific things that I would point to is what's going to be solved by a coup. In previous Nigerian coups, there's often been a very specific issue that the soldiers, at least purportedly, were going to try to be remedying. I don't think that there's any sort of a situation in Nigeria today where anyone in the armed forces could look at a coup as a solution to quickly resolve any sorts of problems. The problem isn't necessarily current political leadership or of the civil or civilian or military variety in terms of their background, but I would find it very difficult to think that anyone would think that a coup could act as a potential solution.
But only time will tell if this prediction will hold.
Thank you, Richard. Thank you, Alex. And special thanks to Dr. Jonathan Powell. As usual, we're going to put links to our sources in our episode notes, and we'll include the links to Dr. Powell's work, as well as a link to CoupCast, the coup prediction algorithm. It's been 22 years since Nigeria's last military coup. 22 years under civilian rule. And in 14 of those civilian years, the presidency has been occupied by former military rulers in civilian clothing. So really, Nigeria has only had about 8 years under civilian rule. The next 2 election cycles after President Buhari's tenure, they're going to be critical in determining the trajectory of the Nigerian experiment. There are no more former military rulers in waiting. Civilians are going to be in charge. But there's no doubt in my mind that the military will be keeping close watch, because at this moment, the Nigerian state is still a very fragile dream. The Backstory is brought to you by EE Media Productions. Production copyright 2021 EE Media Productions. If you enjoyed this episode of The Backstory and want to hear more, subscribe to our 234 Audio YouTube channel. Episodes of this podcast and our other podcasts can also be found on our website, 234audio.com, as well as Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, and wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of The Backstory was produced by Alexandra Gekpe, Richard Anyebe, Dominic Tabakaji, and Sam Tabakaji. Executive producer Rahmat Muhammad. Special thanks to Rabia Hadejia and Malaiwa Gbado Ikaleku. If you are interested in sponsoring this program, reach out to us at 0818-230-1234 or email us at info@234audio.com. I'm Rahmat Muhammad. See you next week.